Husserl speaks of a proto-geometry that addresses vague, in other words, vagabond or nomadic morphological essences. These essences are distinct from sensible things, but also from ideal, royal, or imperial essences. Proto-geometry, the science dealing with them, is itself vague in the etymological sense of vagabond. It is neither inexact, like sensible things, nor exact like ideal essences, but inexact, yet rigorous, essentially and not accidentally inexact. The circle is an organic, ideal, fixed essence, but roundness is a vague and fluent essence, distinct both from the circle and things that are round, a vase, a wheel, the sun. A theorematic figure is a fixed essence, but its transformations, distortions, ablations, and augmentations, all of its variations, form problematic figures that are vague yet rigorous, lens-shaped, umbelliform, or indented. It could be said that vague essences extract from things a determination which is more than thinghood, schiziety, which is that of corporeality, and which perhaps even implies an esprit de corps. But why does Husserl see this as proto-geometry, a kind of halfway point and not a pure science? Why does he make pure essences dependent upon a passage to the limit, when any passage to the limit belongs, as such, to the vague? What we have, rather, are two formally different conceptions of science, and, ontologically, a single field of interaction in which royal science is perpetually appropriating the contents of vague or nomad science, and nomad science is perpetually releasing the contents of royal science. At its limit, all that counts is the constantly moving borderline. In Husserl, and also in Kant, though in the opposite direction, roundness as the schema of the circle, we find a very accurate appreciation of the irreducibility of nomad science, but simultaneously the concern of a man of the state, or one who sides with the state, to maintain a legislative and constituent primacy for royal science. Whenever this primacy is taken for granted, nomad science is made out to be a pre-scientific or parascientific or sub-scientific agency. And more importantly, it is no longer possible to understand the relations between science and technology, between science and practice, because nomad science is not a simple technology or practice, but a scientific field in which the problem of these relations is brought out and resolved in an entirely different way than from the point of view of royal science. The state is perpetually producing and reproducing ideal circles, but a war machine is necessary to make something round. Thus, the specific characteristics of nomad science are what need to be determined in order to understand both the repression it encounters and the interaction containing it. Nomad science does not entertain the same relation to work as royal science. Not that the division of labour in nomad science is any less thorough, it is different. We know that the problem states have always had with journeymen's associations or campagnonages, the nomadic or itinerant bodies of the type formed by masons, carpenters and smiths, etc., settling, sedentarizing labour power, regulating the movement of the flow of labour, assigning it channels and conduits, forming corporations in the sense of organisms, and for the rest, relying on forced manpower recruited on the spot, corvée, or among indigents, charity workshops. This has always been one of the principal affairs of the state, which undertook to conquer both a band vagabondage and a body nomadism. Let us return to the example of Gothic architecture for a reminder of how extensively the journeyman travelled, building cathedrals near and far, scattering construction sites across the land, drawing on an active and passive power, mobility in the strike. That was far from convenient for the state. The state's response was to take over management of the construction sites, merging all the divisions of labour together in the supreme distinction between the intellectual and the manual, the theoretical and the practical, fashioned after the differences between governors and governed. In the nomad sciences, as in the royal sciences, we find the existence of a plane, but not at all in the same way. The ground-level plane of the Gothic journeyman stands in contrast to the metric plane of the architect, which is on paper and off-site. The plane of consistency or composition stands in contrast to another plane, that of organisation or formation. Stone cutting by squaring stands in contrast to stone cutting using templates, which implies the erection of a model for reproduction. Not only can it be said that there is no longer a need for skilled or qualified labour, but that there is a need for unskilled or unqualified labour, for a dequalification of labour. The state does not give power to the intellectuals or conceptual innovators. On the contrary, it makes them a strictly dependent organ with an autonomy that is only imagined, yet is sufficient to divest those whose job it becomes simply to reproduce or implement of all their power, puissance. This does not shield the state from more trouble, this time with the body of intellectuals it itself engendered, but which asserts new nomadic and political claims. In any case, if the state is always finding it necessary to repress the nomad and minor sciences, if it opposes vague essences and the operative geometry of the trait, it does so not because the content of these sciences is inexact or imperfect, or because of their magic or initiatory character, but because they imply a division of labour opposed to the norms of the state. The difference is not extrinsic. The way in which a science or a conception of science participates in the organisation of the social field, and in particular induces a division of labour, is part of that science itself. Royal science is inseparable from a hylomorphic model, implying both a form that organises matter and a matter prepared for the form. It has often been shown that the schema derives less from technology or life than from a society divided into governors and governed, and later intellectuals and manual labourers. What characterises it is that all matter is assigned to content, while all form passes into expression. It seems that nomad science is more immediately sensitive to the connection between content and expression in themselves, each of these two terms encompassing both form and matter. Thus, matter in nomad science is never prepared, and therefore homogenized matter, but is essentially laden with singularities, which constitute a form of content. And neither is expression formal. It is inseparable from pertinent traits, which constitute a matter of expression. This is an entirely different schema, as we shall see. We can get a preliminary idea of this situation by recalling the most general characteristic of nomad art, in which a dynamic connection between support and ornament replaces the matter-form dialectic. From the point of view of nomad science, which presents itself as an art as much as a technique, the division of labour fully exists, but does not employ the form-matter duality, even in the case of one-to-one correspondences. Rather, it follows the connections between singularities of matter and traits of expression, and lodges on the level of these connections, whether they be natural or forced. This is another organisation of work and of the social field through work. It is instructive to contrast two models of science, after the manner of Plato and the Timaeus. One could be called compars and the other dispars. The compars is the legal or legalist model employed by royal science. The search for laws consists in extracting constants, even if those constants are in the relations between variables, equations. An invariable form for variables, a variable matter of the invariant, such as the foundation of the hylomorphic schema. But for the dispars as an element of nomad science, the relevant distinction is material forces rather than matter form. Here it is not exactly a question of extracting constants from variables, but of placing the variables themselves in a state of continuous variation. If there are still equations, they are adequations, inequations, differential equations, irreducible to the algebraic form and inseparable from a sensible intuition of variation. They seize or determine singularities in the matter instead of constituting a general form. They effect individuations by way of events or hikaetes, not by way of the object as a compound of matter and form. Vague essences are nothing other than hikaetes. In all these respects, there is an opposition between the logos and the nomos, the law and the nomos, prompting the comment that the law still, quote-unquote, savours of morality. This does not mean, however, that the legal model knows nothing of forces, the play of forces. That it does can be easily seen in the homogeneous space corresponding to the compars. Homogeneous space is in no way a smooth space. On the contrary, it is the form of striated space, the space of pillars. It is striated by the fall of bodies, the verticals of gravity, the distribution of matter into parallel layers, the lamellar and laminar movement of flows. These parallel verticals have formed an independent dimension capable of spreading everywhere, of formalizing all the other dimensions, of striating all of space in all of its directions so as to render it homogeneous. The vertical distance between 2 points provides the mode of comparison for the universal distance between 2 other points. Universal attraction became the law of all laws, in that it set the rule for the one-to-one correspondence between 2 bodies, and each time science discovered a new field, it sought to formalize it in the same mode as the field of gravity. Even chemistry became a royal science, only by virtue of an entire theoretical elaboration of the notion of weight. Euclidean space is found on that famous parallel postulate. But the parallels in question are, in the first place, gravitational parallels, and correspond to the forces exerted by gravity on all the elements of a body presumed to fill that space. It is the point of applications of the resultant of all these parallel forces that remains invariable when their common direction is changed or the body is rotated, the centre of gravity. In short, it seems that the force of gravity lies at the basis of a laminar, striated, homogeneous and centred space. It forms the foundation for those multiplicities termed metric or arborescent, the dimensions of which are independent of the situation and are expressed with the aid of units and points, movements from one point to another. It was not some metaphysical concern, but an effectively scientific one that frequently led scientists in the 19th century to ask if all forces were not reducible to gravity, or rather to the form of attraction that gives gravity a universal value, a constant relation for all variables, and by unique import, 2 bodies at a time and no more. It is the form of interiority of all science. The nomos, or the dispars, is entirely different. Not that the other forces refute gravity or contradict attraction, though it is true that they do not go against them. They do not result from them either. They do not depend on them, but bear witness to events that are always supplementary or of, quote-unquote, variable affects. Each time a new field opened up in science, under conditions making this a far more important notion than that of form or object, it proved to be irreducible to the field of attraction in the model of the gravitational forces, although not contradicting them. It affirmed a more, or an excess, and lodged itself in that excess, that deviation. When chemistry took a decisive step forward, it was always by adding to the force of weight liaisons of another type, for example, electric, that transformed the nature of chemical equations. But it will be noted that the simplest considerations of velocity immediately introduce the difference between vertical descent and curvilinear motion, or more generally between the straight line and the curve, in the differential form of the Kleinemann, or the smallest deviation, the minimum excess. Smooth space is precisely the space of the smallest deviation. Therefore, it has no homogeneity, except between infinitely proximate points, and the linking of proximities is effected independently of any determined path. It is a space of contact, of small tactile or manual actions of contact, rather than a visual space like Euclid's striated space. Smooth space is a field without conduits or channels. A field, a heterogeneous smooth space, is wedded to a very particular type of multiplicity, non-metric, a-centered, rhizomatic multiplicities which occupy space without counting it and can only be explored by legwork. They do not meet the visual condition of being observable from a point in space external to them. Examples are the system of sounds, or even of colours, in opposition to Euclidean space. When we oppose speed and slowness, the quick and the weighty, celeritas and gravitas, this must not be seen as a quantitative opposition, nor as a mythological structure, although Dumézil has established the mythological importance of this opposition precisely in relation to the state apparatus and its natural gravity. The opposition is both qualitative and scientific, to the extent that speed is not only an abstract characteristic of movement in general, but is incarnated in a moving body that deviates, however slightly, from its line of descent or gravity. Slow and rapid are not quantitative degrees of movement, but two types of qualified movement, whatever the speed of the former or the tardiness of the latter. Strictly speaking, it cannot be said that a body that is dropped has a speed, however fast it falls, but rather that it has an infinitely decreasing slowness in accordance with the law of falling bodies. Laminar movement, which striates space, which goes from one point to another, is weighty, but rapidity, celerity, only apply to movement which deviates to the minimum extent and thereafter assumes a vortical motion. Occupying a smooth space, actually tracing smooth space itself. In this space, matter flow can no longer be cut into parallel layers, and movement no longer allows itself to be hemmed into bi-unique relations between points. In this sense, the role of the qualitative opposition, gravity, celerity, heavy, light, slow, rapid, is not that of a quantifiable scientific determination, but of a condition that is coextensive to science, and that regulates both the separation and the mixing of the two models, their possible interpenetration, the domination of one by the other, their alternative. And the best formulation, that of Michel Serres, is indeed couched in terms of an alternative, whatever mixes or compositions there may be. Quote, physics is reducible to two sciences, a general theory of routes and paths, and a global theory of waves. End quote. The distinction must be made between two types of science, or scientific procedures. One consists in reproducing, the other in following. The first has to do with reproduction, iteration and reiteration. The other, having to do with itineration, is the sum of the itinerant, ambulant sciences. Itineration is too readily reduced to a modality of technology, or of the application and verification of science, but this is not the case. Following is not at all the same thing as reproducing, and one never follows in order to reproduce. The ideal of reproduction, deduction, or induction is part of royal science, at all times and in all places, and treats differences of time and place as so many variables, the constant form of which is extracted precisely by the law. For the same phenomena to recur in a gravitational and striated space, it is sufficient for the same conditions to obtain, or for the same constant relation to hold between the differing conditions and the variable phenomena. Reproducing implies the permanence of a fixed point of view that is external to what is reproduced, watching the flow from the bank. But following is something different from the ideal of reproduction. Not better, just different. One is obliged to follow when one is in search of the singularities of a matter, or rather of a material, and not out to discover a form. When one escapes the force of gravity to enter a field of celerity, when one ceases to contemplate the course of a laminar flow in a determinate direction, to be carried away by a vortical flow, when one is involved with the continuous variation of variables instead of extracting constants from them, etc., and the meaning of the earth completely changes. With the legal model, one is constantly re-territorializing around a point of view, on a domain, according to a set of constant relations. But with the ambulant model, the process of deterritorialization constitutes and extends the territory itself. Quote, "Go first to your old plant and watch carefully the watercourse made by the rain. By now the rain must have carried the seeds far away. Watch the crevices made by the runoff and from them determine the direction of the flow. Then find the plant that is growing at the furthest point from your plant. All the plants that are growing in between are yours. Later, you can extend the size of your territory." End quote. There are itinerant, ambulant sciences that consist in following a flow in a vectorial field across which singularities are scattered like so many accidents, problems. For example, why is primitive metallurgy necessarily an ambulant science that confers upon smiths a quasi-nomadic status? It could be objected that in these examples it is still a question of going from one point to another, even if they are singular points, through the intermediary of channels, and that it is still possible to cut the flow into layers. But this is only true to the extent that ambulant procedures and processes are necessarily connected with a striated space, always formalized by royal science, which deprives them of their models, submits them to its own model, and only allows them to exist in the capacity of technologies or applied science. As a general rule, a smooth space, a vectorial field, a non-metric multiplicity are always translatable and necessarily translated into a compass, a fundamental operation by which one repeatedly overlays upon each point of smooth space a tangent Euclidean space endowed with a sufficient number of dimensions, by which one reintroduces parallelism between two vectors, treating multiplicity as though it were immersed in this homogeneous and striated space of reproduction, instead of continuing to follow it in an exploration by legwork. This is the triumph of the logos, or the law, over the nomos. But the complexity of this operation testifies to the existence of resistances that it must overcome. Whenever ambulant procedure and process are returned to their own model, The points regain their position as singularities that exclude all bi-unique relations. The flow regains its curvilinear and vortical motions that excludes any parallelism between vectors. Smooth space reconquers the properties of contact that prevent it from remaining homogeneous and striated. There is always a current preventing the ambulant or itinerant sciences from being completely internalized in the reproductive royal sciences. There is a type of ambulant scientist whom state scientists are forever fighting or integrating or allying with, even going so far as to propose a minor position for them within the legal system of science and technology. It is not that the ambulant sciences are more saturated with irrational procedures, mystery and magic. They only get that way when they fall into abeyance. And the royal sciences, for their part, also surround themselves with much priestliness and magic. Rather, what comes out in the rivalry between the two models is that the ambulant or nomad sciences do not destine science to take on an autonomous power, or even have an autonomous development. They do not have the means for that, since they subordinate all their operations to the sensible conditions of intuition and construction, following the flow of matter, tracing and connecting up smooth space. Everything is situated in an objective zone of fluctuation that is coextensive with reality itself. However refined or rigorous, quote-unquote, approximate knowledge is still dependent upon sensitive and sensible evaluations that pose more problems than they solve. Problematics is still its only mode. In contrast, what is proper to royal science, to its theorematic or axiomatic power, is to isolate all operations from the conditions of intuition, making them true intrinsic concepts or quote-unquote categories. That is precisely why deterritorialization, in this kind of science, implies a re-territorialization in the conceptual apparatus. Without this categorical, apodictic apparatus, the differential operations will be constrained to follow the evolution of a phenomena. What is more, since the experimentation would be open air and the construction at ground level, the coordinates permitting them to be erected as stable models would never become available. Certain of these requirements are translated in terms of safety. The two cathedrals at Orleans and Beauvais collapsed at the end of the 12th century, and control calculations are difficult to effect for the constructions of ambulant science. Although safety is a fundamental element in the theoretical norms of the state and of the political ideal, there is also something else at issue as well. Due to all their procedures, démarches, the ambulant sciences quickly overstep the possibility of calculation. They inhabit that more that exceeds the space of reproduction, and soon run into problems that are insurmountable from that point of view. They eventually resolve those problems by means of a real-life operation. The solutions are supposed to come from a set of activities which constitute them as non-autonomous. Only royal science, in contrast, has at its disposal a metric power, puissance, that can define a conceptual apparatus or an autonomy of science, including the autonomy of experimental science. That is why it is necessary to couple ambulant spaces with a space of homogeneity, without which the laws of physics would depend on particular points of space. But this is less a translation than a constitution. Precisely that constitution which the ambulant sciences did not undertake and do not have the means to undertake. In the field of interaction of the two sciences, the ambulant sciences confine themselves to inventing problems, the solution of which is linked to an entire set of collective, non-scientific activities. but the scientific solution of which depends, on the contrary, on royal science, and the way it has transformed the problem by introducing it into its theorematic apparatus and its organisation of work. This is somewhat like intuition and intelligence in Bergson, where only intelligence has the scientific means to solve formally the problems posed by intuition, problems that intuition would be content to entrust to the qualitative activities of a humanity engaged in following matter.